right? Who's going first?
I'm going to go first.
Okay, go for it.
Sorry, I'm going to read a little bit. My verbose nature and tendency to digress in this limited time have all, led me to do that a little bit. But my name is Tyson Cross. I'm the Wilderness and Trails Program Manager on the McKenzie River Ranger District on the Willamette National Forest. And we're going to talk about this recreation and wildlife, in particular wilderness stewardship performance in the fish and wildlife element. So here's a short outline. I think you'll enjoy that. I'm just going to talk about wilderness and how the landscape is different, and then move on to the WSP for fish and wildlife. So signed on September 3rd, 1964 by Lyndon B. Johnson, the Wilderness Act is one of the most monumental pieces of environmental legislation ever enacted in the world. As one of the simplest and most straightforward pieces of legislation ever passed by Congress, the Act defines wilderness as lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its primeval character and influence without permanent improvement or human habituation, and that which has outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. And they should also be devoted to the public purpose of recreation, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historic use. So a few things. So to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefit of an enduring wilderness resource, these areas shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such a manner that will leave them unimpaired for future use as wilderness. So that section 2A stuff is getting at the perpetuity of the wilderness resource. And this has all come down to our agency mandate, which is to preserve and enhance wilderness character. So what is wilderness character? The Arthur Carhart Wilderness Training Center has broken down wilderness character into 5 components: natural, undeveloped, untrammeled, opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, and other features of value such as ecological, geological, features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historic value. So what I want to point out here is that wilderness areas are not recreation areas. We don't treat any of these 5 qualities as more important than the other one. And recreation is an important part of wilderness, but it is only one piece. So by creating a landscape where natural processes dominate, the people of the United States have taken a huge step forward in protecting biodiversity and biomass, a simple metric for promoting healthy natural ecosystems. Wilderness is an important reservoir for not just the charismatic megafauna, but also the non-charismatic microfauna, and is an ecosystem where both game and non-game species have equal standing. So though the Wilderness Act is our greatest insurance policy for the perpetuation of wildlife, it is universally recognized that these island ecosystems are at a continual risk of modification from outside sources. Climate change, invasive species, and intentional manipulation of the ecosystem from humans, such as fire suppression and the stalking of non-native fish, along with ever-shrinking connected corridors outside of the wilderness, continue to threaten wildlife. So in recognition of this, land management agencies have taken steps to work within the legal framework of the Wilderness Act to manage wilderness, looking into the myriad of trade-offs that each management action creates. In an effort to promote proper wilderness management and the reintegration of wilderness management with disciplines outside of recreation, Chief Bosworth instituted the 10-year Wilderness Stewardship Challenge in 2004. The 10-year challenge came as a mandate requiring units to evaluate their current management practices and to strive to accomplish 10 elements. Each element had a total of 10 points that could be gained by implementing specific strategic actions. This challenge ended in 2014 on the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. In recognition of the success of the program, a new and improved mandate was developed, and that's the Wilderness Stewardship Performance Measures. So they're similar, but a little bit different. Wilderness stewardship performance element, you can choose, there's one measure with 10 elements selected from 20. So each element's worth 10 points for a total of 100. 2-point items are additional reporting requirements, so there's a total of 104 points, and managed to standard is 60 points and higher. We all know D's get degrees. So what the Wilderness Advisory Group did is they broke up these 20 different elements into each component of wilderness character and how they relate. And it was our job to select 10 of those. So on the Deschutes and Willamette National Forest, we work really closely in the spirit of single area wilderness management. We have what's called the Cascade Crest Wilderness Working Group. And that's a group that goes across forest boundaries, and it's made up of managers and staff officers and some rangers in order to have a more comprehensive wilderness management plan and strategy. So we got together and we also worked with our specialists with each of these disciplines, and we talked through what are the 10 most important elements to each wilderness area along the Cascade Crest. We chose fish and wildlife is important in many of those areas. So the fish and wildlife element, the description of it is the need to conserve and or recover populations of indigenous fish and or wildlife species in this wilderness has been evaluated and management actions taken as necessary in coordination with the state and Fish Wildlife Agency and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as appropriate, our partners in wildlife management. So this gives you an idea of what the points are gained. I know it's going to be hard to see in there, but essentially there's a 2-point checkbox for the Forest Service having a memorandum of understanding with the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, tribes, and other applicable federal agencies. So that should be done. That's a very important step. And we already had that in place. I think most places do. Then you get 2 points for having an indigenous fish and wildlife management strategy established for the wilderness in coordination with state fish and wildlife agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service as appropriate. And then you can gain 4 points for taking a priority action towards an aquatic species and a terrestrial species in the conservation of those. And then you get 6 points for essentially monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of those actions. A total of 10 points if you have that 2-point checkbox, which you should, is for all management actions identified in that strategy that we've created have been taken. So that's a high bar. So I'm going to let Ruby talk about specifically what we did to get that 2-point initial checkbox. Or I'm sorry, we already have the 2-point. I'm talking about the 2 points for our strategy.
Okay, so what we had on the Willamette, we've always had a lot of enthusiasm for wilderness amongst the biologist group, and I believe on the Deschutes as well. But in the past, we've never really taken too many actions in the wilderness. For one, it's hard to get to. For two, there's a lot of competing priorities. And so this process, the timing was really good for us to focus a little bit on wilderness. And so we have 7 wilderness areas on the Willamette and the Deschutes. Some of them are shared that had fish and wildlife as one of the optional elements selected as part of the wilderness stewardship performance. And out of those 7 areas, in 2017, we selected 3 of the areas to develop a strategy. And we applied for one of the national grants, and it was received. That was great. And so we selected the Three Sisters Wilderness, one of the largest, which is shared amongst both forests. The Middle Santiam is a tiny little area that's on the west side, and then the Waldo Lake is a medium-sized area on the Willamette National Forest. And so when you look at this picture of the Three Sisters Wilderness, you can see it's a vast area, well over 250,000 acres. There's a diversity of habitats, many different habitat types. And so it was a challenge to figure out what is it that we want to do out here to maintain the species. We felt like we hadn't done a lot, and so it took a lot of people, an effort by many different people, to try to figure this out. And in the past, I've been on the Willamette for many years now, and we've had just a few efforts in the wilderness. We've developed a no fire retardant and a no dip net zone for lakes that had Oregon spotted frogs, which is a threatened species. We did some trail rerouting in the 90s to protect Oregon spotted frog habitat. We've provided some support to monitor populations and survey habitat. Back in the 90s, we did some spring helicopter surveys jointly with the Umpqua National Forest that were aerial, and then we followed up with ground efforts, and that was pretty intense. It didn't result in finding any wolverines. And we also assisted ODF&W with a carnivore survey project in 2011 and 2012 on both sides of the crest. And then we had some randomized camera stations starting probably back in the 1990s using, really inexpensive cameras with 110 cartridges and flash cubes. And it was just randomly placed however we could, wherever we could get, to try and determine if we had wolverines and some of these rare carnivores. And then we've been doing BioBlitz surveys on the Willamette starting in 2014, and we've been doing these every year since then. And that's also really just scratches the surface of what it is that is out there. It takes a lot of effort, but it's been really successful in terms of team building by the biologists, and it gets us out of the office, but it's also been a lot of hard work. And we go out there at the height of mosquito season, so I can tell you, it's not always that fun every moment. But we've been doing that every year, and I think we'll keep on doing that. So the timing for this national process was really perfect because we had some new species that had been added to our sensitive species list where we felt like we didn't really know whether we had occurrence in the wilderness, where we had them, and so we really had a gap of knowledge for western bumblebees, Sierra Nevada red fox, northern water thrush that also occur outside of the wilderness, but we felt like we had some really excellent habitat. And for example, the Sierra Nevada red fox is believed to live above about 4,000 feet, so that puts it right along the crest there. We had other species that we had habitat for that we really didn't know much about, and that was, Oregon spotted frog. Do we have more locations with that species? There's spotted owl habitat that had been also surveyed by the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, I think back in the early 1990s, where we had, no knowledge of, do those pairs still exist there? Peregrine falcon habitat. The gray wolf seems to be coming back. Occasionally there's been sightings reported. And then non-listed species, cascade frog and mountain goat, which the mountain goat was recently reintroduced to the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, and since then it has traveled into the Mount Jefferson Wilderness and also is now on the Mount Washington Wilderness. So there's been concerns, we have the species, new species, are there impacts? There was a lot that we wanted to know, and so the timing for this process was right. So when we got the grant, we knew that there had been a previous indigenous species strategy developed on the Gila and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness in 2016. And this is there's a Wilderness SharePoint website with a lot of great information. So I was able to review this plan and look at what it is they did to develop their strategy. And they selected, one of the first parts of the strategy is you select your species that you're going to focus on. And they had selected about 5 species or species group, all of which had existing work in the wilderness by research partners. There were strategies developed for the species as well, but they had about 5 species. And so our process on the Willamette and the Deschutes, we involved both forests, Deschutes, Willamette. We had a spring workshop that was attended by about 24 people. That included the state biologists from both sides. It included wilderness and fire managers and the Fish and Wildlife Service as well. And so the goals of the workshop were initially we wanted to all get together in one room, and that was very beneficial in terms of the networking. And we just wanted to talk about the characteristics of the wilderness areas, the species presence, what it is we knew, what it is we didn't know, the habitat potential, as well as the fire history. And the wilderness managers were there kind of in a role in terms of guiding us, because in the past there have been instances where wildlife biologists or fisheries biologists have wanted to implement actions in the wilderness that were not appropriate for the Wilderness Act. So that was where the wilderness managers came in to kind of guide us in terms of, you know, if we were recommending any actions that were not appropriate. And so the first part of this workshop was to identify the list of the priority indigenous species with a perceived management need. And that doesn't include all the species that are listed, all the species of concern, but so I wanted to find indigenous are those wildlife and fish species that historically occurred within the wilderness area without human assistance. And so the goals of the strategy were to improve their status if the persistence in the wilderness was threatened, or potentially consider, do we want to reintroduce any of these indigenous species if they were no longer there. And, you know, the Wilderness Stewardship Handbook, it's now in version 2, listed out what are the criteria for selecting these species. Those would be species listed as threatened, endangered, or sensitive, proposed species, species identified by the state of Oregon as conservation or management priorities, species that are being actively managed, but that does not include harvest of species, whether there's partner resources available to support the species objectives, species with core historic or current range that falls largely or entirely in the wilderness, and then indigenous species of particular interest to local managers. So you can imagine you put 24 individuals in one room and there's going to be a long list of species with the many species we currently have on our list. So we came up with 14 species. This is the final list, and that included cutthroat trout, rainbow trout. Under the mammals we had Pacific fisher, which has not been documented on the Willamette in the wilderness. We only have one documented location. Sierra Nevada red fox, mountain goat, gray wolf, American beaver, and that's because of the connection to the Oregon spotted frog, peregrine falcon, northern spotted owl, northern water thrush, Oregon spotted frog, Cascades frog, and then we have the relatively new invertebrates that are on the sensitive species list, the western bumblebee and the suckly bumblebee. So you can imagine not having a lot of information that we would have a lot of recommendations for what it is we'd like to do. In addition, we discussed other species that we decided didn't meet the criteria, and then there were species suggested at the time that was mule deer, sooty grouse, Clark's nutcracker, tailed frog, and east side species of east side salamanders, where when we got to developing our strategy, it was later determined that no, there's nothing that we can currently do that would help these species. So they got removed from our list. And we discussed what we knew about the species, and we talked about possible actions that we'd like to take. And at that point, the wilderness managers would also get involved in these discussions in terms of what is allowed, what is not allowed. We had discussed the wilderness lakes fish stocking issue, and how we may want to develop some scientific wilderness sensitive surveys to determine the actual use by the public. And in our strategy, we documented the current status. We focused on some near-term 5-year survey monitoring goals. We developed effectiveness monitoring questions to determine if we were meeting these goals. And we also informed we checked in with our forest supervisors to find out if there is any direction they wanted us to take this strategy. And there's not going to be time to go, I could speak for several hours probably about all the recommendations that were made for all the species, but you're more than welcome to, I'll put a copy out during the break. You can look at what we came up with. But anyway, this was our strategy, and it's very comprehensive, but it's also intended to be a living document. This is not the final all. It's intended to be reviewed regularly, and I expect that we'll have at least annual meetings, and we should really, it's time that we review our effectiveness monitoring questions to determine are we making any progress. And we in this document we put a short table that kind of tries to summarize some of the actions for all the species. A lot of the work is going to be baseline monitoring to determine where do these species occur, what is their abundance. But there were some commonalities for many of the species, such as allowing fire to prevail in the wilderness can benefit the red fox, the wolf, peregrine falcon, northern spotted owl, Oregon spotted frog, the bumblebees, and we felt like, yeah, last summer we were very successful with that because we had one of the largest fire seasons ever. And overall, it burned very well in the wilderness in a patchy pattern, so we feel like, yeah, that was the start of the future. It was also a very challenging year. And the strategy also, it encouraged a lot of the communications, both internally between the biologists, the wilderness managers, and as well as externally. I think some of our partners we don't frequently connect with, maybe more at the forest level, but not at the district levels. And so I think there was an open line of communications with a lot more discussions about what is going on with these species, things that we had been thinking about and talking about, but less across the boundaries of talking to our partners about that. So I think that this is going to encourage some solid ongoing efforts for wilderness in our work. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm that was built or maintained. Do we still have time? We have time. I can hit on some of the highlights for some of the species. For the Oregon spotted frog, we're going to continue to monitor the existing populations that we have as well as the threats. This summer we're going to be looking at some high quality habitat outside the known area to assess if we have possibly any other additional populations. During all of the previous years as blitzes, we have not found any, but it's time that we look. And for bumblebees, I think we've definitely we found some of the highest density, which isn't very dense, but we definitely have determined that the wilderness areas in the Three Sisters in particular has some of the highest density of the western bumblebees as compared to where they formerly existed at lower elevations that are no longer there. And so I think what we're going to be doing is for our 2018 grant that we also applied for and we received funding for 4 additional wilderness areas. We'd like to finish it up so that we have a strategy for all of our 7 wilderness areas. And we think that this process has been very successful in terms of getting our goals together, documenting what our goals are, but it's definitely not a mechanism to fund all the future work in the wilderness. And while there's points that we can continue to gain, we found it to be somewhat challenging to try to say that we've actually we've done on-the-ground work for an aquatic and a terrestrial species, and I think we're working on that. But I think it's going to be very difficult to get us up into the higher point values of the strategy the way it's currently working out for us. But I think, and there's so much out there that needs to be done for all these species. The species list will change. I think the focus will change over time. So we're just really scratching the surface of everything that could be done out there. And yeah, are there any questions? I think that's all I have.
Thank you, guys. answer one question for these guys? Otherwise, you can catch them at the break.
Question over here.
Question, are you stretching or are you questioning? Oh, up there.
I just wanted to ask how the conversations went when you were having your meetings, especially with some of the state and other partners around action in wilderness versus restraint.
Can you repeat the question? Because there's...
Yes, she's asking how the conversations went when we had our meetings with some of the partners as far as taking actions or restraint. And I think currently, the wildlife biologists, we haven't been really recommending any actions just yet. I think we're still at the point of trying to collect more information and determine where we have issues. We have done, I mean, we're spread so thin over so many vast areas that I think we're still at the point of doing some baseline survey work at this point in time.
All right. Thank you, Ruby and Casey. Appreciate it.